If you're watching this, then you're feeling stuck in your language learning. You can follow the content, you can read, you can write, you can hold a conversation and make yourself understood. You make the occasional error, but people understand you. And you've stopped improving. That is the part that nobody warns you about. There are 4 steps on the path to fluency, and this is the last one. It is the step that takes you from where you are right now to actually being fluent. And it is the one that nobody teaches. Every app stops before it, every course stops before it, and most videos about how to become fluent in a language doesn't actually get you there. There is a line from an anime I watched called My Hero Academia that explains what is happening. And it explains it better than anything that I could ever write myself. And it's the following. There's no way that somebody who's at level 50 levels up at the same rate as somebody who's at level 1. That's you. If you're reaching the point where you feel like you're stuck, where you're not making the progress that you used to do, it might not be the case that you're doing something wrong. It might just be the case that you've gotten so far that in order for you to see the same level of improvement that you saw earlier, you have to put in that much more effort over a longer period of time. You already know so much. The base that you're trying to expand by a couple of percent is big by now. And expanding it, therefore, requires that much more work. And especially the last step. If you went fast, you notice that plateau approaching a lot more suddenly, and it feels like something broke. The thing is, nothing broke. You're learning the same amount of new words as you were in the beginning, and you're just not getting the same noticeable improvements from them. One thing before I go further, because it stops a lot of people thinking this video applies to them, you do not have to be at step 4 in everything. You can be at step 4 in comprehension and in writing, and then still be at step 3 in speaking, where you're stumbling a bit and making errors. This is perfectly fine. Most people are not as good at speaking their thoughts as they are at writing them. Some people are better, some are worse, and it is going to be the same way in a language that you're learning. Speaking tends to land last, and there is a practical reason for that. You can get listening practice by watching and listening to things. You can get reading and writing practice because you can bring that with you on your phone. Speaking practice is a lot more difficult. It tends to cost money. It needs another person, and if that's a tutor, then it costs money. And the tutor or a friend, if you're lucky enough to have that actually speaks the language that you're learning, is not going to be readily available everywhere. So people deprioritize it, and it arrives last. That's completely normal. So here's what step 4 actually looked like for me. Portuguese is the language that I've learned on my own, that I'm fluent in. I'm not fluent in French. I could say that I speak French, but I'm not there yet. And therefore, I'm focusing more on Portuguese. I was finding a bunch of methods of interacting with Portuguese as much as possible. And that was what I needed for fluency. I brought podcasts with me to the gym, and I found one that had really long episodes. That was great. I found a bunch of content that was dubbed into Portuguese. I was translating every single game that I was playing into Portuguese, if I could. And the biggest thing that I did was that I started experimenting with speeding up the content as well. That one change cut down so much on the amount of time it took me to get enough new vocabulary, because that is really what this comes down to. Repetition and vocabulary. And all the other goals that you might have. Sounding more like a native speaker, those go into step 4 as well. So here is the mechanic, and this is the part that you can use today. By the point where I was squarely in step 4, I was so used to the feeling of, without speeding it up, I was actually getting close to 100% comprehension when I was listening to podcast episodes. But when I sped it up, I could get back to around 90%, and I was picking up new words a lot more quickly because I was seeing a lot more of them, or I was hearing a lot more of them, and that was something that I was willing to accept, even if that meant that it was slightly harder to follow the episodes. I would aim at understanding about 90%, and that was sort of the number that I was comfortable with, just because I was already used to not understanding everything. I think I was at that point when I was listening at 1.25 in the beginning, and then gradually I worked myself up to 1.5, and then eventually twice the speed, and sometimes even more than that. And it really just depended on what I was watching. I still enjoyed watching Pokemon, so I could watch Pokemon episodes sped up. It sounds ridiculous, watching something that you watch to enjoy it, and then you watch it sped up. But for me, it worked. And the thing is, if you're watching something simple like Pokemon, then you could speed that up a lot more than you could, for instance, watching Suits, which is a lot more complex. I chose to limit myself at 90% comprehension and not speed up more to make it harder, because at 90% it was still enjoyable. It is still something I can find myself doing for hours on end, and if it gets any harder than that, it is slightly more of a chore. And you don't want that when you're going for fluency. You want something that you can binge into while still learning from it. There is a second benefit, and it has nothing to do with actual volume, and it is that most commercially made TV content is spoken at more or less a set speed. And that's not really the case in the real world. Not everyone speaks at the same rate, and speeding up content gets you used to that. And it means that you can interact with more people, and that's just really beneficial, especially when you're going for fluency. So there are limits to this, and you can get to fluency without ever speeding up content, but it is just that much quicker this way. And part of why it worked so well for me is personal. I was already used to listening to fast content in English. I'd been fully convinced by a YouTuber called Ali Abdal, and I watched a few podcast episodes of his where he was talking about this. And so, due to me being used to it in English, I was understanding everything. That also meant that Portuguese content by nature felt a bit slow and therefore slightly less engaging. It mattered a lot more to me that I was improving than that I was 100% comfortable. And that is mostly personal preference. You might not agree with me, but it is useful. Now the things that stop paying. And the first one is looking words up. At this point, there is no longer any need to stop and look up a single word, because you're able to pick up the words from context. And the context is moving so quickly, if you're listening to things that are sped up, that if you stopped, you would lose out on that much more content. So it feels weird, but if you're speeding things up and you're pausing because you don't understand things, you're actually learning less than if you just went with it. And that's just because you don't get through the same amount of new material. By listening, you pick up most of the new words anyways, and so you don't really need to look them up. The second thing that changes is the structure around speaking. Mine was no longer structured at all. At this point, I had already met at that point, my girlfriend, who is now my wife, and we were having regular calls. It was just the way that I practiced my speaking. It was nothing that was particularly scheduled, but it definitely helped. I'm now in a very lucky position when it comes to my Portuguese. For most people, that will not be the case, which means that they will have to actually look for as many opportunities as possible to practice the language that they're learning. And that's why French is taking a lot longer for me to get to fluency, because I don't have that same thing there. So with AI being so popular, there are naturally going to be people looking to substitute a teacher with AI, especially when there's nobody to talk to. It does cover part of it, and AI tutor can help you with mistakes in your syntax, like how you make a sentence. It can help you choose better words and conjugate the words correctly, but it can never comment on pronunciation. Accents and pronunciations are something that the transcript it gets from listening to you will never be able to pick up. It's not a small gap, but if you know what it covers and what it does not, then you have something specific to look out for during the few times that you actually have a real tutor or a real conversation partner that is fluent and a native speaker. And then while you're using AI, you can focus on the things that AI can actually test you with. If you watched my other videos on like step 1, 2, and 3, then you might be looking at all this and thinking that it contradicts them. I've been telling you to keep friction low. I told you to start speaking early, and now I'm telling you to make content harder and to drop the structure. I've never been a big fan of looking words up. The only place that I would ever suggest it is in the very early beginning, where you have to actually learn the individual words. That's necessary before you're able to apply them and to learn other words from context. And at this point, if you're really aiming for fluency, the language has to actually become a part of your life. It cannot be something that you put up, that you do for 30 minutes and then for the rest of the day you do not interact with it. It's a shift that you have to do. It could be that you have a bunch of shows that you watch purely in that language, or in my case, at least 50% of the conversations that I have are in Portuguese, which is also the honest reason that nobody teaches this step. No app, as far as I believe, can really get you to fluency, at least none that exist yet. And it is very obvious why. By this point, you have gone so deep into what you're interested in that the language has become so individual to you. It is becoming part of who you are, and that also means that what I am going to need is completely different from what another person is going to need. That is coming from somebody that has made an app, and I mean, I'm looking into an AI tutor and making that as good as possible, but at this point, it does not get you to fluency. So what do you actually do this week? The most impactful thing you can do at this point is to experiment with speeding up the content. What's something slightly faster than you normally would? And if you're starting to understand less than 90%, then you're probably going too fast. But 90%, you're good to go. And then there's my other go-to. If you find a book that you also have the audiobook available for, then speed that up and read along with it. You get the reading anchor, and you're able to read faster because you're listening to the same thing at the same time. So be realistic about what this does. It is still not going to get you to be fluent in a month. That is not something that you can hope for. What it does is cut the time down because you're getting through more content per hour, and if you keep stacking the hours, then you're going to keep stacking more effective hours. What that will feel like as you start is that it will feel a little bit like backtracking because you're now not suddenly able to pick up on everything. That does feel counterintuitive because you expect to be noticing that you're making progress. But in this case, it is going to feel slightly less like that. That is the trait, and if you choose that on purpose, then you're doing something right. One last thing, because people ask what comes after this. In my opinion, there is no step 5. With my method at least. And I would also say that there is no getting through step 4 either, because there is always something that you can improve when it comes to the language. You can get the accent down a bit better, you can get pronunciation a bit better, there's always more vocabulary that you can learn, and there are always more subjects that you are able to use in conversation, provided that you actually study them. I still, at this point, have conversations with my wife where I'm learning new vocabulary in Portuguese because we're talking about something that we've never talked about, and then I won't necessarily know how to talk about that in English because I haven't learned that in English despite me being fluent in English. Sometimes it even happens in Norwegian. You're always going to be learning and you're always going to be at step 4, but the things that you do in step 4 are always going to be useful, regardless of where you are in your language, which is why I would say that step 4 is the real end.